Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the podcast, host Craig Jeffery joins Ashley Pater, Chief Product Officer at GTreasury, to cover questions from their webinar on why a treasury management system should be the cornerstone of your treasury transformation. They share valuable insights and examples on how to transition treasury operations to a modern and efficient technology stack, complete with automation and integration that allows organizations to focus on strategic tasks. Listen in to find out more.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, Ashley.
Thanks, Craig. Excited to be here today.
We had a good time on that webinar where we talked about why a TMS should be the cornerstone of your treasury transformation. And it is fun when there's an overflow of questions. And we had promised to respond to those questions. And we could have either done it in writing or with a podcast. So we've done it with a podcast. So I'm excited to have this discussion and to talk through these items. But let's begin. One of the questions that came in, and I'll start it, and we can both talk about it. But in terms of APIs and the number of records that can be processed, at what point do you recommend a file-based process versus an API-based process? I want to set that up a little bit, and maybe we should talk about that at first. Is we were talking about making connections, and then there's a historical file-based process route. And I think we also talked about scaling or capacity issues there. But is there a break point where you say, let's go from API to file-based or vice versa?
You know, one of the things we talked about on the webinar was everybody's going to be moving more towards this API-based architecture at some point, right? Now, SFTP, unfortunately, probably won't go anywhere overnight. You know, while it's legacy, it's definitely going to stick around for a bit. But I think as we start to see more APIs become available, I think it's important to start to think about how you're going to adopt it within your organization. And there's a couple ways to think about that, right? One, volume isn't the only driver. It may be for specific APIs, if you're looking at things from a payment standpoint or what have you. There may be some immediate performance benefits there. But I think overall, you know, the key benefit of the API, there isn't necessarily a key threshold that I would suggest at this stage. I think it's something you're going to have to do eventually anyway. It's just where you are at in your journey as an organization and probably where your financial institutions are or your ERPs or what have you. That'll also drive that as well. You know, the key thing with APIs that's a benefit aside from, you know, volume, performance, and things of that nature is also some more simplicity of it, right? So how quickly you can onboard some of these things. And, you know, connectivity is probably one of the things that takes the longest time during an implementation. Whether that is balance reporting or payments or what have you, APIs can reduce that onboarding drastically. So you're looking, you know, instead of 4 to 6 weeks, you're doing things in minutes or hours. There's that user self-sufficiency aspect as well, where, you know, there isn't so much dependency on the TMS provider or the bank, where you as a user can help set these APIs up with that self-sufficient onboarding as well. So I think, you know, it's a long-winded way to say, I don't think volume should be the only driver. I don't think it is the only driver. I think you're going to have to move to these API-based solutions anyway. So wherever your organization is on that journey and kind of thinking about being an early adopter in some of these, I think has a lot of benefits.
That's a really useful discussion because it's where things are heading. Thinking back to the last major transition between how large files were delivered, they were oftentimes delivered by tape. This was a physical device that people would drive to the bank. This was a long time ago. And you couldn't transmit because the transmission speeds were very slow. And unless you paid for a dedicated circuit from your company to the bank, you might not be able to transmit in a time within the time frame that would exist before it would time out. And so there was tape deliveries. Well, as speed improved, you got rid of the old tape deliveries and you would do some type of file transfer, at the example here. And I think the same thing has happened, but very quickly on the API side where, you know, initially you set things up, there might be some latency issues or timeouts were set, but those get tuned, or those have been tuned with the early banks extraordinarily quickly. I mean, I think that's been your experience.
Yeah, and I think that's the great thing about you can make those updates relatively quickly, and you can be agile and react as well. Right now, I don't know how long it'll last, but right now there's also a lot of cost benefits to starting to leverage APIs. And I think that's another benefit as well. Like thinking of things from a bank fee perspective, we're starting to see that with some of our early adopters of our bank APIs. So it's another component, but the performance aspect, and also you can determine that, right? You can determine how frequently you want to do those pulls, how truly real time do you want it to be in some of these instances, which I think is another nice benefit. But the performance and the ability to kind of pivot, adapt, and make some of those changes as need be, whether it's a new authentication process, a performance improvement, what have you, it's a lot more efficient as well, which I think from a technology standpoint is really exciting.
The cost example, I want to spend a lot of time talking on that, but I know we shouldn't.
Probably a whole other podcast.
Well, it's interesting, as people move to offering Swift and other methods, sometimes they were priced more highly and sometimes priced more lowly. I think one of the things that we're, like you're seeing, is there's a bit of a price benefit there. But I think the longer game is that we're going to get a lot more information more readily. The cost per something will go down, will stay lower, but people will pull a lot more information. And banks will certainly price it so they can make their money, whichever method the connection is. And they should. But you bring up some really good points there. Now, shall we move on to another 3-letter acronym?
Absolutely.
So one of the questions was, can you provide examples of how RPA, or robotic process automation, and machine learning, two different things, are used in Treasury departments? I don't know if you wanted to start with that, talking about bots or machine learning. I've got a few things to share as well.
Yeah, I'll start with machine learning and then we can kind of wrap up on RPA as well. So I think machine learning is something that's going to come up more and more, and you're starting to see it be part of the initial framework and architecture within TMSs as they start to build it out. I think it's a matter of time for Treasury and treasurers to get confident in truly leveraging machine learning. But, we're definitely starting to see the demand for this pop up. There's a couple of key areas that are no-brainers, and we look at this application of machine learning as the evolution of intelligent treasury, right? Like, how do you continuously start to have your platform evolve from being a transactional-based platform to a more predictive analytics tool? Forecasting is probably the one everyone sees most common. The ability to be able to auto-detect variance analysis, provide system recommendations on where you can potentially perform better or forecast better. Another key candidate here is definitely within reconciliation, kind of starting to determine confidence thresholds where the system can auto-reconcile for you. Hey, I feel 90% confident, but I want to make sure the system's 97% confident before it auto-reconciles. So there's some of those things. And then fraud detection, hey, you normally make this payment for $1.2 million at the quarter, you scheduled it for $120,000. Are you sure that's right? So I think those are some of the key ones you're going to start to see happening within TMS platforms. And now it's just a matter of time is how do you get Treasury departments confident with leveraging these tools to make those decisions? And that's going to be a journey, right? It's just like any new technology with APIs back in the day too. We're still talking about APIs, they're new technology, but it took time for people to get confident with those as well. So I think you'll start to see that evolution with machine learning. On the RPA side, I think there's two portions, right? One, how does a TMS provider offer or leverage an RPA? But there's also Treasury departments that are using it completely separate from a TMS, and that's what we see a lot as well. Obviously, within our organization, and for onboarding of customers, we leverage RPA to do some of those static data tasks, onboarding tasks. Within our own organization, we leverage it in different ways, whether it's doing security and compliance, or helping our services team, or even from an onboarding perspective or internal processes within the product team. We have an internal bot that we use, GWiz. He's our go-to guy. I know you always love talking about GWiz, Craig, but he's critical to us. But I think we see a lot of our corporate clients also adopting this, whether it's doing data management and formatting on their side, account reconciliation, reporting, liquidity and exposure management. So there's other ways they're doing it outside of their TMS or within their own organization that I think is really fascinating to see as well.
Yeah, I think the name GWiz is pretty interesting, but you start anthropomorphizing this guy who does a lot of stuff, and I just wonder what that's going to do to us over time. But no, seriously. So on the RPA side, the robotic process automation, we always, not always, but we typically think of companies and see companies using this to bridge the gap between systems. I need to go out and get something, check, validate, move it into another system separately. Now, I know we just spoke in the section before about APIs. If there's an API that can handle that, checking, validation, loading, well, you would certainly use that. That would be almost always superior to, an RPA or a bot that does it. Bots can break if information flows differently or changes, but there's a massive amount of data that has to be pulled, reviewed, loaded. Things have to be checked, and bots help us eliminate many, many of these tasks. And so treasury groups are doing that. There's some podcasts where we talk about, where I interview people that are using, RPA very heavily in treasury and in finance, and are just saving massive amounts of time, huge number of hours, people years worth of events, of activity. And this allows them to address many other functions. So, you can always wait for almost forever to replace it with an API. You might really be able to realize some benefits on the RPA side, and a number of companies are doing that. So that and you gave a lot of good examples with GWiz or your bot. That's like, hey, I got to load a bunch of data. Why do I need to do all these steps? How come I can't just use like a great macro that takes stuff from one system and puts it in another? Real good uses there. Now, I'm going to mess up the order of these questions just for fun. One was a question, how many respondents are in the fraud survey, for example, where they're asking about surveys, and there was over 330 respondents in that one. But I'm not sure if I have a question on this. There were other surveys that informed this particular webinar, and in our show notes, we'll put information about downloading those. There's a Treasury technology survey that was also done with GTreasury. We'll have that in the show notes so you can download and get information on that. And there's a cash forecast and visibility survey, which I believe is active right now. So the results will be coming soon. So I know you and GTreasury like data, and many of our listeners do too. So that's that quick question. I wanted to dispense with that one. And now I'll move to another question. This was a little different because it touched on AR and AP, which some don't look at that as being within treasury transformation. But the question was, would you say most companies handle AP and AR solutions via their bank's treasury management platform, or are more companies starting to use non-FI service providers? And I don't know if you want to start on that or if you want me to. How would you like to go?
Yeah, why don't you take a stab at that, Craig, and I'll chime in here.
We do a lot of surveys and work with companies across the finance spectrum. So, touches on the cash conversion cycle, like AP, AR, and Treasury, of course. One element here is that, AP and AR over time, now this is not a massive shift, but it is happening, but they're converging more and more with Treasury on working capital management, but also on payments. And so we see this, as the growth of payments outbound and inbound are happening, Treasury is getting more involved there, and they're working together. Treasury continues to take more of a leadership role and tends to have more groups reporting into them, at least for responsibilities for payments. And that varies company by company, but we're seeing that. The other points, Ashley, that we think is really interesting is this end-to-end view that organizations are taking. And that includes AP and AR, not just Treasury. But AP is looking at how does this work in our organization, but also with the other organizations, AR side of the business. So very, very interesting that they're saying what we do impacts someone up and downstream, even outside our organization. I think that's a mature view, and that's good progress. Finally, before we get to the discussion of why this might be the case, growth, more companies are looking to tech firms they have in the past. Most of the activity is with banks, but tech firms continue to gain an increased share of the market, and more companies are looking at tech firms to help solve some of these solutions. They trust their banks. Tech firms are oftentimes providing very comprehensive solutions or more impactful solutions, and then banks are partnering and white labeling with those. But maybe that gives us a chance to talk about why and what are you seeing?
There's always going to be some healthy tension between finance and treasury, but we're starting to see that like a natural convergence between the two, right? And you hit on one of the key areas that we see that a lot in, which is payments, right? And focus more on having that centralized end-to-end solution, extending the usage of a TMS to accommodate the finance side of the organization. And we touched on this a little bit in the webinar, growing your ecosystem as well, right? That, being able to connect to all the necessary third-party data that you have. And I think because that is so critical, I mean, you look at the surveys we've done with you guys, but, you look at some of the Big Four surveys or what have you, like the criticality of, having that robust ecosystem is so key as part of these projects that it naturally brings in that kind of APAR side of life as well. And I think that that's a great thing to see. You want to have that centralized location. It doesn't mean you have to have one system, but it has one system that connects to the systems that you need, right? And maybe you focus on a couple of those core functions where you really do want to have just, a one-stop shop or a one system to do that. Maybe that's payments, maybe that's for your reporting or what have you. But, I think that we start to see the Office of the CFO moving towards extending the TMS usage in this area and integrating a bit more. And I think that's really exciting to see. It's exciting to see from an open architecture platform because that's really key to a lot of our vendors and providers. And I think as we've talked more and more about APIs and having that data readily at your fingertips, because the number one thing that each one of these areas wants is visibility. And they want visibility and they want the ability to execute on those things quickly and have that full view and not always have to depend on one person or one team or another. And so I think having that natural convergence is really exciting to see from our standpoint. And I'm excited for the opportunities it brings for us, but also for our users as well.
Great. So the next question or the last question group is can the system, so it's talking about treasury systems, can the system reconcile forecasted balance and show where there are discrepancies in order to improve the forecast? And the question had some other things about, do we do this manually? So maybe we can broaden that discussion to, beyond just can a system reconcile forecasting, but to talk about broadly what's needed to reconcile well and how does a system help that?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, you hit on this earlier too. We have a survey going on right now, so it'll be interesting to see how these kind of demands and interest and priorities shift as a result of this. But from the conversations we've had, the surveys we've done in the past, look, forecasting is still going to be the number one thing everyone wants to do, the number one thing no one has time to do it. So I think having a solution that can scale from the basics to the advanced scenarios is very key, right? So the reconciliation portion of forecasting is key, and it's kind of the next critical component aside from, hey, how do I get all my data in a place so I can forecast? Now I have it. Now how can I do my scenario variance analysis, which is a key component, and then how can I kind of have that evolve and do the reconciliation process is kind of the natural forecasting flow from basic, intermediate to advanced. So absolutely, this is something that's key within all TMS providers. It's definitely something, as we talked earlier about too, there's some great opportunities for machine learning and AI to come into play as part of this as well. Intraday matching functionality is probably one of the most common areas we see for this on a reconciliation standpoint. And that absolutely can be automated. It can be manual if you prefer. It's also up to the customer preference. But, the key here is to be able to match off the bank versus the back office data, removing one side of the match and having that, display on the reporting or worksheet or what have you that you want. So it's definitely a key component to that forecasting workflow. And then how you want to apply that to all your various scenarios and variances is also a key component as well.
Two things I wanted to highlight from your answer. This idea that it's been multiple years that people are saying, I need to spend more time on forecasts, and I would spend more time. I don't do it as well as I should. We've got to focus on that. And your point, tying that into your point about machine learning, is we're never going to get there just by throwing more people at it. We have to have tools that help. And like you said, machine learning can help with pattern detection, offer an ability to scale, a tool that helps us scale what we're doing. I think the other part that's at the core of the question, and I'll try to be brief on this, is that, what do we do with discrepancies? When we see discrepancies, there might be an element where the machine learning process helps us identify that. But as we see discrepancies in a forecast, that can be a feedback loop where we learn, somebody didn't report a very significant item. That's a human communication issue. We're spotting trends and changes. Well, maybe machine learning points that out. Or we have a different mix of business and we've got everything lumped into a broad category so we don't see how components of that are shifting. Maybe we need a different level of detail. So,
yeah, and I think too, 2021 has, it's been a more normal year compared to what we've had in the past. I wouldn't say it's the definition of normal, but if you look at 2020, things started to stabilize a little bit. So how does a 2020 impact your historical, and your future forecasting as well, right? I think that's we saw a lot of customers having to do more frequent forecasts like everybody did last year. How that has transitioned to how you forecast in 2021 and beyond. Is that now part of your DNA? Do you still need to do weekly, daily forecasts versus your typical monthly, quarterly, annual? So I think it's been interesting too to watch. You'll still have I think we'll still see a lot of the common drivers and things with forecasting, but I think how you think about forecasting, how that's changed as a result of the pandemic is also kind of interesting to see as well. And for that, you need to have those tools in order for that to be successful.
Your point about the doing forecasts more frequently, we have certainly seen people running them more frequently. We've also seen them running more models. Both of those create a stress point for very human-centered forecasts, people-intensive forecasts. So I think those are two good points, that the expectation is more, and we need tech to roll that out. Now that brings us, Ashley, to our last set of questions. I grouped these two together. I'll read them, and then we can dialogue on these. So these are questions about, getting senior management buy-in and front-end costs for putting in TMS systems. This was part of the webinar questions that we had from that. And so what do you see from corporates as the biggest challenge in getting senior management buy-in to invest more in a TMS? The other question was, are there any projections for the reduced front-end costs for installing TMS, Treasury Management Systems? This seemingly has been the main roadblock from upper-level management teams. So maybe you could begin the response there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple key things here. And I know there's plenty, we could talk about kind of the key qualitative and quantitative value propositions for a TMS for, probably multiple hours, I would say. But here's kind of a couple of the things that we're seeing. The biggest thing that we find to be successful when trying to get buy-in from senior management is being able to produce some tangible ROI as well, right? By doing this, we're gonna see the results of X. And one, there's some functionality where you can have a slam dunk on that, right? The easiest one is bank fee analysis. So I think if you're looking for hard dollar amounts, it also depends what your internal business objectives are. What's the core driver here? I think there's some, financial ROIs that will really resonate with your CFO, right? So, and I think we've done some stuff with you guys in the past too, Craig, on ROI calculators and things of that nature. So, I think there's some really great opportunities to be able to justify some of those hard dollar costs. But then also, if you're going through a treasury transformation process as an organization, here we're going to be revamping X, Y, and Z processes, and, we'll see the benefits of that by implementing this TMS provider because of automation or what have you. There's a lot of benefits. Like, in order for your internal treasury transformation to be successful, you need to have this technology counterpart in order for that to have the impact that you want. The other portion of that question in regards to what about reducing front-end costs for installing a TMS? Look, I think as we've seen the persona of the Treasury Department evolve, they want to be a bit more self-sufficient than I think we've seen in the past, which is really exciting to see. So how can the onboarding process be easier also impacts that. So we started this podcast talking about APIs, so I'll probably slightly finish it by talking about APIs, but that's a great example of an area where you can reduce your time and reduce your costs by leveraging APIs for connectivity. There's things like, having more of these workflow-based implementations and self-service onboarding tools that are going to help that as well. So it's definitely core to how TMS providers are starting to evolve how they build their product. And I think you'll start to see that kind of happen more and more as time goes on.
Yeah, and I think a couple points that you made, or just to expand on or comment on, the historical view of how difficult things are. Each version of tech gets easier, faster, smoother, and if we're looking at how we do things now versus 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and sometimes that's the residual organizational memory or the experience that people have. And so it's true because it's in their head, but it's also outdated. And so this ability to adapt to what does it look like today? How is that changing? What's changing? How much is it changing? What's not changing? And that can have a big influence on, the cost to do something is less. The time to realizing value is shorter. The pain and headaches are less. And I think that's really important to make sure when we're going through those processes, we're bringing senior management along, making sure they understand what's different. And, the time to value, the overall strategic value to the organization are ways that these can be removed. And that's such a vital aspect to helping your organization. You've got to be able to justify the tech and the tools to make it work.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that has always been a recurring theme as we talk to Treasury departments, as you look at these surveys, is I want to be able to do more strategic-based initiatives and less day-to-day, tactical tasks, right? Like, how do I get out of the weeds and start to think about that? And if you're talking about that with your senior management, I think that's a huge portion to play towards that. As you apply this technology, you can do more of those things. Treasury is a huge strategic partner within all organizations now. They have a seat at the board table, and it's having that strategic outlook of that and being able to automate some of these tasks and start to be able to focus on those strategic initiatives from a Treasury department point of view, I think is really, really critical.
Very good. Ashley, thank you so much for extending the conversation from the webinar onto the podcast. Really appreciate your comments.
Yeah, thanks for the time, Craig. Always a pleasure. Appreciate it.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.